a very important question. We know people use different substances for different reasons, but how harmful is substance use really? Is this something we really should be concerned about? Well, substance use has a lot of short-term consequences. It has a lot of long-term consequences, and we're just going to cover some of the basics. So on the short term, we're talking about injuries, overdose, and infectious diseases. So injuries. Now, injuries occur among the substance-using population as a result of intoxication. Essentially, they're cognitively impaired, they're physically impaired, and they simply can't control their motor functions, or they think they can do something when in reality they can't. So these injuries occur in a variety of ways, and this can be permanent injuries, or in terms of disability, or even death. So you're talking about things like motor vehicle crashes, drunk driving, falls, drowning, burns, but you're also talking about things like violence, intentional violence. So people who use substances are more likely to commit homicide. They're more likely to commit suicide. They're more likely to be a part of sexual assault on either side. They're more likely to be a part of intimate partner violence on either side. So there's a lot of ways people can get injured as a result of intoxication after using a legal or an illicit substance. Now, overdose. Overdose includes alcohol poisoning and essentially means that someone took too much of a substance than their body can process. So they're getting some secondary side effects that they don't necessarily want, and really they don't want at all. Now, overdose risk itself will vary tremendously by substance. I have not heard of a case of a marijuana overdose. It has almost no risk of actually causing an overdose. Where you have the opioids, where the risk of overdose is very high. That's why we talk about things like Narcan and way to mitigate overdose deaths, because it's so easy to do. And the symptoms of overdose do vary quite a bit by the symptoms themselves. So when you talk about opioids, an opioid overdose typically involves respiratory depression. That's the way the drug works. In this case, it's actually stopping people from breathing. And that is why one of the ways people will ultimately succumb to an opioid overdose. We're talking about cocaine or amphetamines, the stimulants, the really hardcore stimulants. Those can actually give people a myocardial infarction, a heart attack, or even a stroke because their blood pressure is so high. Their heart is beating so fast. It actually causes a heart attack. And then when you're talking about MDMA, ecstasy actually causes your body to produce heat. So you can actually overheat from the inside out. Now, overdose, the risk of overdose is not the same throughout the population or throughout the substance using population. Men, particularly young men, young adults, and the people who use the most are at the greatest risk. Now that makes sense, right? The more likely you are to use a substance, the more likely you are to overdose on the substance. Now, this is the trend in opioid deaths in the United States from 2000 to 2014. All overdose deaths involving some type of opioid is the solid line up at the top. This is the opioid epidemic. You see it gradually increasing over time. But you see there's variability between the types of opioids that people are overdosing on. The natural and semi-synthetic opioids, those are your Vicodins and your Oxycontins. Those are actually the most, people are most likely to overdose on those type of drugs compared to the other ones. But if you look at from about 2010 to 2014, you see two types of opioids where there's a very quick uptick. One is heroin. Now, the heroin overdoses, the uptick in heroin overdose is an offshoot of the opioid epidemic. Essentially, it's cheaper for people to get heroin than it is to get a prescription drug for illicit purposes if they need to purchase the drugs, which is a separate issue. But you may not be able to regulate yourself as easy using heroin as a pill, which has a very consistent dose, and it's very easy to regulate that dose. So that in part has led to this increase in heroin deaths. And then finally, you look at this bottom line, these are the synthetic opioids. This is things like fentanyl, where fentanyl is something like 50 to 100 times more powerful than morphine, and it takes a very small amount to induce an opioid overdose. Another short-term consequence of substance use are infectious diseases. Now, someone can acquire an infectious disease through a direct and an indirect way. When we're talking about a direct risk of acquiring an infectious disease, we're really talking about the injection drug use population. Injection drug users, there's a high prevalence of individuals who share needles. When you're sharing needles, you're essentially sharing blood. So it's very easy to transmit blood-borne pathogens from one injection drug user to another. So injection drug use ends up resulting in a very high prevalence of viral infections such as HIV and hepatitis in the injection drug use populations. So for example, about 1.5 million people who inject drugs, who are injection drug users, have HIV. Over 6 million have hepatitis C. And about 1.5, 1.25, somewhere in that range, have both. So infectious disease is a very high risk of people who don't use clean needles. Now, the indirect risk is partly related to intoxication and partly related to the effects of the drug, because when you're using a substance, you're more likely to be involved in activities which can cause an infectious disease, particularly around sex. So the more times you're involved in a risky sexual activity, and a risky sexual activity could be sex without a condom, it could be sex with multiple partners, it could be sex with multiple partners in a short amount of time, that will increase your risk of acquiring a sexually transmitted infection and ultimately increase your risk of having this infectious disease, of course. Now, in addition to those short-term consequences, there are long-term consequences of substance use in terms of chronic disease and mental illness. So substance use, pretty much all kinds, are risk factors for this variety of chronic diseases, of non-communicable diseases. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. There are many more than this, but you're talking about things like high blood pressure, heart disease, stroke, liver disease, particularly with alcohol use, cancer, dementia, Alzheimer's. Substance use is a risk factor for Alzheimer's, as well as multiple, if not all, types of cancer. So there are very many long-term consequences of excessive substance use that problem drug users need to be, or should be, aware of. Now, mental illness. Now, this is a tricky one, but it is important to discuss and have you aware of. Now, substance use disorders themselves are classified as a mental illness. But there are also elevated rates of non-substance use mental disorders in patients with a substance use disorder. For example, I think this better clarifies it. 78% of people addicted to opioids have one or more comorbid mental illnesses that aren't related to a substance use. So 78% of opioid addicts have depression or anxiety or have a psychotic disorder. So there's a lot of overlap. Even though substance use disorders themselves are classified as a mental illness, there's a lot of overlap between substance use disorders and other types of mental illness. But it's very, very difficult to determine which came first. Did the mental illness come first, or did the substance use disorder come first? Because the mental disorder is often present prior to the initiation of drug use, but not all the time. So there are some times where the drug use and the symptoms are really kind of the same thing. The criteria used to diagnose the different types of disorders often have many things that are overlapping. And then the symptoms of the mental illness, the symptoms of depression, the symptoms of anxiety often go away once the substance has stopped being used. So again, it's very hard to determine what is the exact relationship between mental illness and substance use. So what is the impact of all of this? Now, there's a lot of ways to determine the public health impact of substance use. One of the ways that we're going to focus on here is through the Global Burden of Disease study. Now, this is an extraordinary large study involving thousands of scientists in hundreds of different countries. But it's important because they've created a way to standardize the impact of a disease and the risk factors for each country. And the way they've standardized this is using a metric known as the Disability Adjusted Life Year. Now, this DALY, or DALY, depending on who's saying it, combines the idea of the number of years lost due to ill health, so essentially the years of potential life lost, the quality of life, so how much disability it actually occurs, and then premature mortality. So when we're talking about substance use disorders, essentially how many deaths does it actually occur? So we won't talk about dailies yet. We're just going to talk about deaths. So drug use disorders themselves, not necessarily the secondary consequences of drug use disorder, but the drug use disorder themselves causes just over 2 per 100,000 deaths each year. It's a relatively low percentage of deaths. We have slightly higher in the data available due to things like liver disease due to alcohol use or liver cancer due to alcohol use. But overall, the direct cause of death from drug use disorders is relatively low. And that's particularly true when you compare it to things like cardiovascular disease and cancer. So again, this is the direct cause of death. So how many people die directly due to their alcohol use disorder? That gets dwarfed by the number of people who directly die due to cardiovascular disease. Here are the dailies directly attributable to the substance use disorder themselves. So we're on the par of 150 for alcohol use disorders daily per 100,000 that are lost each year. Overall, drug use disorders take away about 200 to 225 dailies per year. But again, this is dwarfed by the amount of dailies taken away by cardiovascular disease and cancer. But we're interested in the impact of substance use, not from the direct number of deaths that the substance use disorder will cause itself, but we're interested in substance use as a risk factor because it causes more things than just the disorder. Again, we talked about the long-term consequences and the short-term consequences of substance use. So here we're talking about substance use as a risk factor and how many dailies, how many disability-adjusted life years do they cause on a yearly basis. So tobacco's use causes about 170 million dailies each year. Alcohol use causes about 80 million dailies each year. Illicit substance use is much lower, but you're still in the order of about 20 to 30 million dailies each year. And using this information, we realize that even though drug use disorders don't actually cause a lot of deaths themselves, there are a lot of deaths attributable to substance use. So 11.5% of all of the deaths in the world for 2015 were caused by tobacco use alone, in some way, shape, or form. It's not that someone, for example, died of nicotine poisoning or choked when they were trying to use a cigarette or something, or couldn't breathe because of the smoke that they were inhaling. But it's because of all these downstream consequences of their tobacco use. It's all these short-term consequences of tobacco use. It's all of the long-term consequences of tobacco use. And it is worth noting that over half of all of these deaths attributable to tobacco use come from very few countries. So it's China, India, Russia, and the United States is where the biggest impacts are.